Hi, it's Sharon here, and as promised, this is a more detailed video about the problem that I had at the end of 2020, coming into a bit of 2021, and how I resolved it. Now, it's not so much about the details of the physical condition, because the solution isn't physical. It is the really important understanding that I got from what was happening. It's a very profound realization for me personally, and I wanted to share it as soon as possible because I feel like other people will make this same mistake that I made in my understanding, and it was a mistake in my understanding that partially caused it. And if you're a spiritual seeker, you may fall into this same trap. I have got notes with me for this video, and the reason is this understanding is still quite new, and I wanted to make sure I use the correct wording to explain the understanding. Normally I just sort of talk a bit more off the cuff with a few kind of bullet points, but I have actually written notes on this because the wording is so important in this understanding, and it's so important in the misunderstanding. So if you see me look down or you see me look across, I am looking at my notes because I wanted to sort of offer this understanding in the same order that I received the understanding, just so that as a service to you, to make sure I'm as accurate as I can be in the wording. Okay, so the situation that happened was that in 2020 I started to become very sensitive to vibration, but specifically electronic devices and Wi-Fi. And it was fine during the day, didn't really bother me. The difficulty was at night. When I would sleep, I would physically feel electronic devices scanning for Wi-Fi, and it took me a long time to figure out what that vibration I was feeling was. My heart wouldn't rest properly because of the nature of the scanning, and so I tried to find a physical solution to begin with, which was my first mistake. And that is the most logical thing you can do. It's a mind solution, is to move electronic devices out of the bedroom when I slept, which didn't really work. To be honest, it didn't really work. Especially because where I sleep, my bedroom has got a boiler upstairs, and that boiler has a Wi-Fi signal to communicate with the downstairs temperature gauge. So as soon as the heating doesn't even have to go on, it just scans constantly for Wi-Fi, as do all the devices, unless you put like phones and tablets and stuff, unless you put it on airplane mode. So I was having very, very disruptive sleep, and if I had bad sleep in the night and I tried to sleep during the day, guess what? Well, there's even more devices going off during the day, and I was getting quite tired. So that was the experience that I was having. So if you watched the video How to Solve All Your Problems Part 2, you will know then that part of the problem that I then created was I labelled this to be a problem. I have a problem with this vibration, feeling all of this vibration. So that was my first mistake, was trying to find a physical solution. The second mistake was labelling it as a problem that I had, because then my mind scanned, actually searched out the vibration. So eventually, realising that moving devices was not helping, I actually sat down to try and figure out what the hell was really going on. And in that searching for the truth of what was going on, I discovered some really important misunderstandings. So before I get onto the misunderstandings, the good news was that the sensitivity to vibration was actually part of a new process of healing and a new ability that was coming through. Great news. I've only really had a glimpse of it. I don't really understand it yet. I have a long way to go with it, but I recognized that the ability to tap into this level, the depth of vibration was going to be, has a positive impact. But then I fell into this trap, this mind trap, and that was causing disruption. So I had to resolve that so that I can just carry on with my life and then work on this nice positive part of this ability. So the vibrational sensitivity on the positive side was there was a new healing ability coming through. So what was really going on, and why was it happening in a negative way that was disrupting my sleep? So I'd labelled it a problem, so my mind had started to scan for this problem and then reinforced it. So that was the first thing. But then what I discovered, and I'm going to do this step by step, so I did say I'm going to have to read some of this so that I don't miss anything. And that is, the first thing that happened was that I realised I was in training to these mechanical devices. Now, in the past, if someone had asked me about electrosensitivity, sensitivity to Wi-Fi or 5G or 4G and everything, my answer would have been, you're not standing in your own power, and if you're standing in your own power, then such things in the physical world cannot touch you. So I recognised that was probably true for me, but it didn't feel true for me because I do a lot of spiritual work and I felt like I was standing in my power. But I also knew that was my belief and that was true. So I'd have to go looking for the truth of that. And so when I asked, why am I in training to these, and this is what I realized, I was in training to these mechanical devices, and while they were searching for Wi-Fi. Well, why would I be in training to a mechanical device if I was standing in my true power? And so and then this is what I discovered. So because I'd been on the spiritual path, and because I sort of on a very deep level kind of had a feeling that part of the spiritual journey was to diminish the sense of self, and this is where the error occurred. I totally misunderstood what was needed. And so when I say, oh, if you're standing in your true power, nothing can really touch you, including, Wi-Fi signals and everything else, that is actually true. But what I had been doing is I'd been trying, and I realized I had actually in 2020 been trying to diminish my sense of self, not in a bad way, but what I considered to be a spiritually important way, right? Because we've always talked about the idea of not that you're going to get rid of the ego, but that, that personality, the small I, the one that keeps you small, the one that keeps you stuck, that it doesn't really have a big part to play in our lives. So we can kind of dissolve that a little bit, and then, as the importance of the small I, the personality dissolves, sort of then the more of the big I, the divine I can come through. So I realized I'd actively been doing that, and this is where my big error occurred, because the self and the ego are two different things, and the self is needed, whereas the ego is not. And so this is why I wanted to make sure I had notes on this to explain this clearly. So I've always said that when it comes to things like autoimmune illnesses and cancers, that if your body doesn't know what self is, then is it any wonder it attacks self by mistake, right? It's not an error, except for the fact that you need to know what self is. If you don't know, the body doesn't know what self is, it doesn't know what to protect and what to attack. So that's on the energetic kind of an emotional kind of plane. So I've always said self is really important, and then I still fell into this incorrect understanding, and this is what caused the problem. So I had been consciously trying to sort of dissolve the self, or I hadn't been conscious, wouldn't have used the word self, but that is what I was doing. But you need the self, right? And so this is what I then realized through this investigation. So you need the self because the self acts as an energetic anchor in time and space. So who you are, who you show up as, let's say Sharon, needs an energetic anchor. And that anchor is the self. So the self is always required. We're not diminishing the self. It's like our tether. It's like our anchor. And the ego is the identification with that. And what we don't require in life is that identification of the ego with the self. So I'm going to just read from my notes a little bit here. So it's really about the attachment to self. So self performs a function, and it's an important energetic function. It's the way you're individualized as a person in the big field of energy that exists in the quantum field. How do you identify who Sharon is? That individualization is yourself, the small self. And so you don't develop the self, you don't have to grow the self, you don't diminish the self. It just performs a function as an anchor of individualization for the purposes of experiencing life, right? And the key thing is to not be attached to that self, right? So it's the attachment to self, not the self itself. So you do need the self as an anchor. This was my misunderstanding, right? So you don't, when you realize that yourself is just a functionality of existence, right? It doesn't need developing. It doesn't source anything. Your personality and your this persona you've created is not the source or creator of success or legacy or, you know, all the things that you take pride of in life. It's not the source, right? Yourself is not the source. It is just an anchor in this world. Then you recognize that the self, the small self, is a projection of the divine. So they're not actually separate. Although we're seen as individuals, we're not actually separate. So it's a bit like watching a movie on a movie screen being life, and the self is being projected onto the screen so you can watch this really lovely movie that you'll call your life on the screen of life. But where does it come from? That self comes from the bigger self, the big I, the divine. So you're not separate. You are a part of and a projection of the divine. And how are you identified? Well, because you have a self, a small self. Okay. So I had been trying to dissolve the self incorrectly. Hold my hand up to that, right? So when I realized that that the self did not need to be diminished, I sort of had this thought, well, I've been teaching this meditation technique that I was given by Spirit, of which I talk about dissolving the small I into the big I. And I questioned whether or not that was the right thing to be teaching. And I was told, yes, that's fine. And that is correct. But to see, because you're dissolving the small I into the big I, that's totally fine. And, it's, the small I, as the anchor, is a deliberate creation. It's deliberately created so you can experience life, right? As an individualized, no, let's not say it's an illusion, but a projection in its individualized form so that you can have your own unique configuration of experiences, right? So we're not to judge that self, that small self, because it's needed, right? I can't experience life as Sharon if I'm not individualized as a separate body for that experience with my own memories and various things. So that is a deliberate creation of the big I to create a small I so it can have these experiences. So the self is needed as this anchor, but what we dissolve, or what we can let go of more, is the attachment to the self. So I've been dissolving my anchor, and because I've been dissolving my anchor, I didn't have a strong enough sense of self. So I started to entrain, and if you learn quantum touch, you'll know we use this, the word entrainment quite a lot. It comes from quantum physics as well. I was starting to entrain to machinery because I didn't have a sense of self anchoring me to who I was. I was able to kind of, there's no other word apart from entrain to other things, right? So I was coming into resonance with things that were mechanical because it had a vibration. But if my sense of self was strong, that wouldn't have happened. So my understanding of that had always been correct. And so I was trying to understand then, like, if the self is the anchor, then kind of what is the ego part of this equation? Because in spirituality, often we talk about ego and self almost interchangeably sometimes. So I think it's probably going to be a common mistake, which is why I wanted to do this video, to share it. And so the understanding that I was shown was that the ego isn't the self, right? The ego is the belief that it is the self, right? So the ego believes it is the self. It isn't the self. The self is just an anchor, but the ego believes it. Whereas, so that self is... So the self is needed, the ego isn't. The ego is only needed while you're at a lower level of consciousness, because then that ego that believes it is the self acts as an anchor as well. It anchors itself, it attaches itself to the self, and then you kind of, it says, this is who we are, right? But when you reach a higher level of consciousness, you don't need that ego, because when you're at a higher consciousness, you know that your ego isn't yourself. You know that the self is just an anchor, and you know you can you can unattach from it, or hold it very lightly is probably the better word. You are unattached to the idea of self, the illusion of self. We get obsessed by who are we and where are we and what are we doing and what are we leaving behind us and all these things. And that's the attachment to the self. What does that self mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's just an anchor. So we can have an experience of life. So we realize it doesn't source anything. It isn't who we truly are. But what we truly are is a projection from the divine. And when we know that, our ego is no longer really required to hold that in place. So we can hold it much more lightly. So once I understood that I had tried to diminish, I had sort of incorrectly been trying to diminish, and I had diminished my sense of self, I kind of then intuitively knew, well, I think I know what to do. I need to declassify this as a problem with my mind, so that it no longer scans and entrains to machinery. I put a circle around myself, whereby no vibrations so I couldn't entrain to other things. And I knew that I just had to reinforce within the circle of myself, and strengthen this self back again. It's like strengthening your anchor, like putting the anchor back into the ground, into Mother Earth, and going, right, sorry, I'm here. This is who I am. In terms of anchoring myself back into the world, and then strengthening the sense of self again. Okay, so it was very much a sense of just having to kind of say to myself, I am strong, I am anchored, I know that this self is important, I am this self for the purposes of this exercise. And I just used the mantra of I, just the mantra of I, big I, capital I. And so whenever I fell asleep and I did feel a vibration in my sleep and I was in training in my sleep, I would just, in half sleep, I would just say, I notice that there's a vibration, but it doesn't affect me. It's okay that it exists, but I'm not in training to it. And I would just reaffirm the mantra of I, because when you're half asleep, you really don't want to be getting up and having a whole conversation. So I just reinforced that I know that I'm anchored in the I, the divine I, and that I have an anchor in this world. And it's also a little bit about respecting the fact that I have an individualized self and I don't need to diminish that. And within a few days, it all improved massively. So it really was just a re-strengthening of self and recognizing that the misunderstanding of ego is easily done. It's the attachment to self, not the self itself. The self is needed, it's an anchor, it performs a function, but we don't need to flower it up and make it pretty, develop it or grow it. In that sense, there is a spiritual evolution, but it's not to do with that sense of self. Yeah, and it just made me sort of even more conscious of the fact that the sense of self is really important in health. It is really important in, we kind of, a lot of people have, and I would say most people have some kind of trauma from childhood. And that sense of self does get diminished through experiences. And the self-worth also goes with that usually. And I feel like I have done a lot of work on my own personal trauma, and I have reinstated my self-worth. I've restored it. And yet I still fell into this trap of the misunderstanding of self and ego. And I fell into the trap of labeling it as a problem. So my mind scanned for the vibration. Even though that's what I didn't want to do, my mind still scanned for it because it saw it as a problem and wanted to find it to warn me. But all it did was reinforce it, and actually looking for the problem found that problem. So it's easily done. I think I just do these videos just to say most of the time, look, it's not as easy, and there is these pitfalls, and we all fall into these pitfalls. And that's why I do these videos, to share, like, that I fall into them too. I fell into this misunderstanding. That sourced a problem. It created a problem. But then by unlabeling it as a problem, de-tagging it, it's not a problem. And then by recognizing that the way through this was not about just getting rid of machinery or Wi-Fi or tearing down a 5G signal tower. The answer is always is internal, it's with our own selves, and it's that strengthening of see, it's hard. See, I'm trying to say strengthening of self, but actually it's It's just this, it's just the solidifying of self, right? We don't need to grow it and make it really like bigger than it needs to be. It just performs the function. That key function of self-worth and strong self, that's all is really required. That sense of, I know who I am in this world, and that's all it really is. It doesn't really need to be anything more than that, but that needs to be known to be strong, meaning that you're sourced from the divine. Therefore, nothing can really touch you and hurt you and upset you. And once you sort of stand in, that's the power that you stand in, is recognizing that the physical world doesn't have to affect you. It doesn't affect you if you're standing in your power. You can go about and have fun in life without feeling victimy, right? Without feeling like machines or Wi-Fi or something else in your experience has power over you. That's what the strong self is. That's what the strong anchor is about. It's not really about anything else, really. So I hope this makes sense. It's still quite a new understanding, even for me. I've had to sort of practice it a bit more, embody it more, and there may well be more videos where the understanding deepens even on a deeper level. But I just felt it was really important to share this experience in case it is of service to you, in case you've made the same error, in case you notice that yourself, your anchor, is not well tethered and you've never understood why, and then what to do about it. So I hope this is helpful to you. I certainly have learned a lot from this new understanding and the error of judgment of that. So I hope it's helpful to you too. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.